The Murder Scene podcast is a show that may contain graphic descriptions of violent acts, including those of a sexual nature and bad language. If you feel you may be adversely affected by such content, please do not listen. Listener discretion is advised. Not intended for children.
Hello and welcome to The Murder Scene, a podcast where we delve into the darker side of human nature to explore murders, missing persons, cold cases, serial killers, and all manner of strange, mysterious happenings that fall into the case file marked True Crime. I'm your host, Alex. So, hop into the back of my creepy white van filled with grey tarps and duct tape and let's go! The Murder Scene Podcast, Episode number 4, Part 1, Devil in the Darkness, The Reign of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. In the long, hot summer of 1985, the population of Los Angeles didn't sleep well. They tossed and turned each night, sweltering under a single sheet, sweat sticking the thin fabric to their damp skins as they lay in wait for the click of a lock, the creak of a floorboard, the music of shattered glass to slice through the silence. There was no breeze filtering through an open window to cool them. They were all closed, locked, some were nailed shut. But it wasn't the heat that kept them awake in their beds each night. It was fear. The fear of becoming the next victim of a man the media first named the walk-in killer and the Valley Intruder. But that name wasn't catchy enough for the if it bleeds it leads newshounds of the day. They needed something catchier than that, something darker and sexier, more sinister and enigmatic. And with the media's anti-christening of the devil that plagued the city of angels that summer, came an increase in the fear, the anxiety, the suspicion of everything and everyone. And when people spoke of him, they spoke in hushed tones, behind hands, as if they were afraid saying his name out loud would conjure demons. So they would quietly, discreetly, whisper his new name, the Night Stalker. Sometimes, when a person arrives in this world, they arrive in a perfect storm, where all the planets are aligned to form them, to shape them, to groom them into the most perfect representation of chaos and evil. When a child in their most formative years, their most vulnerable years, are exposed to sex or violence, and especially if the two of them are tied and twisted together, you have some of the essential ingredients needed to create a serial killer. If you add in a turbulent, volatile home life with one violent, abusive, alcoholic parent and one who is a subordinate, silent apologist for the behavior of their spouse, lightning can strike within that perfect storm. One such maelstrom arrived on February the 29th, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, when a child named Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born to mother Mercedes Munoz and Julian Tapia Ramirez. Wee Richie's early life is heartbreaking. He always sought acknowledgement and approval from his father, but seldom received it. At one point, they bonded and grew closer when Richie made his high school football team. Julian was so proud of his sports hero son, until brain damage Richie had received, probably from repeated beatings at home, caused him to develop temporal lobe epilepsy. Once this became apparent, the football team would no longer allow Richie to play. This was an insult to Julian, who behaved like his son was diseased. That Richie having TLE somehow brought shame upon him. Might have been a good idea not to beat 7 shades of shit out of his son on a regular basis and give him brain damage if that was his attitude. Being at home could be so horrendous at times that Richie would seek refuge in a local graveyard and sit alone among the tombstones just to avoid being in his own house with his father. Another early relationship that sealed the fates of many innocent people was with an older cousin, Miguel Angel Valles, who was known as Mike. Mike was a Vietnam veteran and a serial killer. During the war, he raped, murdered, dismembered, and decapitated several Vietnamese women. Richie was only around 11 years old when he began hanging out with Mike. Mike was already in his early 20s and had fought in a war. He delighted in showing photographs of his combat exploits to young Richie. One picture, one that always stuck with him, was of Mike mugging for the camera and holding aloft the severed head of one of his victims like a fucking trophy. That would definitely hang around, festering in your cranium. And it did. Ramirez later said that he was utterly fascinated by the images. They did not frighten or disgust him like they would almost anybody else. Mike was volatile, royally fucked up because of the things he'd done, the things he'd seen. He had a hair trigger and poor impulse control, and when his young wife bitched at him a little too much one day, he shot her in the face at point-blank range, right in front of his young cousin. Richie went home that night and didn't say a word to anybody about what he had witnessed. He dealt with that on his own, alone, and it lingered. It festered. Serial killers, and all their kinks and craziness, all their fetishes and foibles and differing motivators, are mostly unwittingly crafted and created, not born this way. They are made. Parents, families, society as a whole, can be like Dr. Frankenstein. They create a monster, a modern Prometheus crafted from the trauma, the hurt, the sadness, the rage, the disenfranchisement of themselves. Sometimes things that seem innocuous to an adult create an abnormal psychology in a child of a tender age, an age that renders them unable to process certain things the way they should be processed. When I'm talking about little Richie Ramirez, you may hear what you interpret as sympathy in my voice, and you'd be right. Because my heart aches for that little boy who was abused, beaten, and afraid of his own father, who would rather be alone in a creepy cemetery than at home with his dad. And that's as it should be. We should sympathise and have empathy for that child. We should have broken hearts and an abundance of salty tears for any child who's suffered such a start in life. My heart breaks for little Charlie Manson too. A wee boy who nobody wanted, who had to watch his prostitute mother service her clients in their one-room apartment. After she abandoned him, his grandmother looked after him for a while, until she was unable to. When there was no place for him in a state-run children's home, they sent him to an adult prison, where he was repeatedly raped by inmates and guards. If you don't feel for a child who suffers such things, then you don't have a fully functioning heart or soul. For these abused, abandoned, frightened children, we should all weep. You will not, however, hear any sympathy, empathy, or understanding from me for Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. And I'm interested in the abnormal psychology of serial killers, murderers, and other psychotic freaks. I don't want to bang them. I'm not a serial killer groupie, just in case you were wondering. I'm pretty fucking weird, but I'm not that weird. Okay, that said, let's get into it. turned out that Richard Ramirez had been murdering people for longer than anybody knew. Except one guy. There's always one. All the well-seasoned, hard-boiled detectives that serviced the Los Angeles and LA County areas thought this youngster was crazy. They'd whisper things under their breath when he entered or exited a room. Who does this guy think he is, punk motherfucker? See, Gil Carrillo, an LA County Sheriff's Department detective assigned to the Homicide Bureau, was still a baby to the grisly old dicks who had been there for a decade or two, even although he was already in his 30s. Carrillo thought that a spate of home invasions, sometimes with rape, sometimes with murder, sometimes both, or neither, and always with extreme violence, were connected. At the same time, there was a series of child abductions where the child was sexually molested, then abandoned. He felt that the unsub in each of these attacks was the same person, and he was ridiculed for it. They laughed at him. But Carrillo stuck to his guns. He felt it in his gut. He knew it. But people would tell him that was bullshit. That just couldn't be. Perps don't change their ammo. It's fixed. Set in stone. It's burned into their psyches, and there's a pattern to what they do, for a reason. They don't chop and change their methods or their murder weapons. They're creatures of habit. And of course, for the most part, this is true. But on this occasion, that punk motherfucker Gil was right. The perp, who turned out to be Richard Ramirez, was the exception that proved the rule. Ramirez's first murder that we know of wasn't attributed to him until 2009, when DNA evidence found at a crime scene all those years ago was processed and came back as a match. The victim was Mei Lung, a little Chinese-American girl just 9 years old. He raped her and stabbed her to death in the basement of a residential hotel in San Francisco's Tenderloin district. Mei and her family were residents in the same building, but it took 25 years to find out that her killer was the infamous Night Stalker. But the DNA evidence turned up something else. There was a possibility that another person was at the murder scene with him. Police have never released the identity of this person, if they know it, due to a lack of evidence. What's interesting to me about the Mei Lung case is that none of the subsequent child abductions resulted in a murder. He let them all go. He even drove one to a gas station and told her to call the police and tell them to bring her parents to take her home. That victim, as an adult, said that he looked at her almost as if he didn't really want to do what he was doing to her, but he would do it anyway. Was there somebody else with him at the Mei Lung scene? Maybe somebody triggered by her appearance? It's strange. But Gil Carrillo has the answer to this. He says Ramirez told him during an interview that it was all about subservience and compliance. If you subjugated yourself for him, you lived. But if you offered any resistance whatsoever, if you defied him, tried to stop him carrying out his will, you were marked for death. And it was as simple as that. That tiny 9-year-old girl must have fought him for her life, and her efforts are what got her killed because of his psycho criteria. Ramirez was never charged or convicted for any of the child abductions and sexual assaults. The law enforcement logic was that they'd got him on all the Night Stalker murders, attempted murders, rapes, and burglaries, and he was heading straight for death row. There was no point in re-traumatizing the kids by putting them on the witness stand to testify in front of him, even although some of the kids said they wanted to. Good choice by the cops, though. It wasn't necessary. The motherfucker rotted in jail until he died horribly. The first of what we now call the Night Stalker murders happened on June 28, 1984. Ramirez murdered 79-year-old Jenny Vincow in her Glassell Park, Los Angeles apartment. He stabbed her so many times in the head and neck, so violently, he almost decapitated her. He leaves behind a single fingerprint on the bug screen he removed from her window to gain entry. On March 17th, 1985, 22-year-old Maria Hernandez is shot in the face as she pulls into the garage at her Rosemead home in Los Angeles County. But her bunch of keys blocks the bullet from doing fatal damage and sustains a hand injury instead. She plays dead, and the Night Stalker enters her house. Maria's roommate, 34-year-old Dale Okazaki, heard the gunshot and crouches down behind the kitchenette counter. She waits, shaking with fear as a man enters the room. She just waits, stays there, silent, petrified, her fingers white-knuckling on the edge of the countertop. And he just waits. Sure, he could just walk around the side and shoot her before she could even react. He could just stretch across the counter and shoot her without even laying eyes on her. But he doesn't. He waits. Because he knows she's going to pop her head up over that counter any second now, because she has to see him. She has to look. And then he'll shoot her. He wants to see her face. He needs to see her face. That's the whole point. This is why he does it. He wants to see the fear in her eyes, her last seconds on Earth filled with terror, knowing she's going to die, but she has to look. He knows it. She looks. He shoots. And she dies instantly. But he got what he craved. Tear-filled eyes, brimming with fear. That's what stoked the fires inside him. That gave him a better high than any street drug or pharmaceutical he'd ever tried. It was beyond anything that he could take. Other people's fear was his favorite fix. Barely 1 hour later, Ramirez is at Monterey Park, a city in the western San Gabriel Valley. He's not done for the day. He pulls a random woman from her car, Ceylan Yu, known as Veronica, and he shoots her twice with a .22 handgun. She doesn't die at the scene, but is pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. These two murders, and an attempted murder on the same day, sparked massive media attention and was what garnered him the nicknames the Walk-In Killer and the Valley Intruder. To me, this is the most frightening thing about the Night Stalker murders, the randomness. Everything he did was just so random. This is the antithesis of serial killer psychology. Their methods are usually deeply bound to their psychology, to an event or a person. They can be either organized or disorganized, but they usually have strict protocols that they follow. Ramirez had none of that. He was totally random. He'd drive around a random neighborhood and pick a random house to break into and murder the occupants. Or maybe say to himself, next house painted yellow is going to be the one. Or next house with the porch light off is going to be the one. Totally fucking random. That, to me, is the scariest thing about Ramirez. On March 27th, 1985, Ramirez breaks into a home on the outskirts of Whittier. He's actually broken into this house before. The homeowner, 64-year-old Vincent Zazzara, is sound asleep in his bed and never even knew what hit him. Ramirez shoots him in the head where he lies. The sound of the gunshot wakes his younger wife, 44-year-old Maxine, lying next to him. Ramirez begins to beat her and then restrains her, but she breaks free. She knows there's a shotgun under her bed. She has to get to it. She knows it's her only chance of survival. She grabs it, aims straight at Ramirez as he turns back toward her, and she pulls the trigger. Both of them are shocked to find it's not loaded. Ramirez is completely blindsided by this and unloads 3 rounds into her face. He's so unnerved by this incident that when he attempts to rape her corpse, he can't get it up. This enrages him, and he begins stabbing her violently, carves an inverted cross into her flesh on her chest, gouges her eyes out and puts them in a little box, and took them home to keep as souvenirs, a reminder of the night. As he exits, he leaves a perfect footprint of his Avia aerobic sneakers in the dirt of a flower bed. Some bullet casings were matched by ballistics to the others found at previous crime scenes. Now they knew. Now they had to eat a big fat slice of humble pie and admit that Gil Carrillo was right all along. They had a serial killer on their turf. On May 14th, 1985, Ramirez breaks into the Monterey Park home of Bill and Lillian Doy. Bill tries to grab his own handgun from his nightstand as Ramirez approached him, but he shot Bill in the head before he could reach it. He then savagely beats the 66-year-old man until he loses consciousness. He then finds Lillian Doy, Bill's 64-year-old wife, who's in her own separate room. She was a stroke patient and disabled. He restrains her with thumb cuffs, then trashes their home, turning it upside down looking for valuables he can sell to buy blow and pay for his dirty little roach-infested dives he lived in. Meanwhile, Bill regained consciousness and crawled along the floor, clinging to dear life, desperate to reach the phone so he could alert the authorities to help his beloved wife. He made it, got the call in, and lost consciousness again. But in the meantime, Ramirez was brutally raping Lillian and fled before the police got there. Sadly, Bill later died in the hospital from his horrific injuries. But thanks to her husband's heroic effort, Lillian survived the attack. She lived for another few years and died in 1991 at the age of 70. The Ramirez rampage continued on May 29th, 1985, when he drove to Monrovia, a beautiful town nestled at the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains. Two elderly sisters who shared a home, 81-year-old Florence Lang and 83-year-old Mabel Bell. They were known to all their family and friends as Ma and Nettie, respectively. As he crept through the house looking for a weapon, he didn't find a knife, which was what he wanted, but he grabbed a hammer he found in the kitchen. He first went to Florence's bedroom where he restrained the disabled woman before beating her with the hammer. He then shocked her with an electrical cord, raped her, then drew a pentagram on the back of her thigh with her own lipstick, and scrawled them on the walls of both sisters' bedrooms. It wasn't until 48 hours after the attack that the sisters were found. They were alive, but barely, both of them in comas and suffering from horrific injuries. Mabel Bell died in hospital shortly after, and her sister hung on for a while and passed away in August that year. On May 30th, 1985, just 24 hours after his vicious attack on the elderly sisters, Ramirez took a trip to Burbank. This night, he picked the home of 42-year-old Carol Kyle. Carol's 11-year-old son was at home with her. The Night Stalker restrained both of them with handcuffs. At some point, he decided to lock the little boy in a cupboard and set about searching for valuables to sell, trashing the house in the process. Ramirez demanded that she tell him where the valuables in the house were kept. He raped her multiple times, demanding that she didn't look at him, and if she did, he'd take her eyes. Before he disappeared into the night like a vampire bat, he returned the little boy to his mother and handcuffed them to each other again. On July 2nd, 1985, Ramirez picked out another random home, this time in Arcadia. It was 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon's home, a widow and a grandmother. He entered her house stealthily, using some of the tactics Mike taught him back in the day when he was a kid. Ramirez used a lamp base to batter her with until she lost consciousness, then stabbed her to death with her own butcher knife. And even after she was dead, her body limp and motionless, he kept on going, his rage not spent yet, just stabbing over and over again. On July 5th, 1985, beautiful 16-year-old Whitney Bennett lay sound asleep in her bed in a nice, safe neighborhood in Sierra Madre. She had inadvertently left her bedroom window unlocked after opening it that day to yell something down to her dad. He was outside watering the front yard. It was a grave oversight. Whitney woke in the middle of the night with searing pain in her head and her neck area. She had no idea what had happened to her. She cried out for her mother and father and stumbled out of her bedroom into the hall where she collapsed and blacked out. Ramirez, always the opportunist, found her window unlocked and crept inside. He beat Whitney over the head with a tire iron as she lay asleep in her bed, unaware of his presence. But that wasn't enough. He then attempted to find a knife to stab her with, but for some reason couldn't locate one in the kitchen. So he grabbed a telephone cord and tried to strangle her to death with it. But something happened that spooked him. The cord began throwing off sparks of electricity, and Whitney miraculously started breathing again. Ramirez about shit himself and fled the scene, thinking there had just been an act of divine intervention by Jesus Christ himself to save Whitney's life. And survive she did. She needed almost 500 stitches in her brutalized scalp, but she lived to tell the tale and was one of the prosecution's star witnesses in the Night Stalker trial. But wait a minute. That's the second time he's in a kitchen and can't find a knife. How the fuck can you not find a knife in a kitchen? Every kitchen in the universe has knives in it. Anyway. On July 7th, 1985, 60-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson was fast asleep, lying on the couch in the living room of her Monterey Park home. He smashed her skull with his feet, repeatedly raining blows down on her face, killing her, then robbed her. He left yet another print of his shoe behind, this time on his victim's skin. But he wasn't finished yet. He drove around for a while, checking out other neighborhoods, but went back to Monterey Park for some reason. Ramirez handcuffed 63-year-old Sophie Dickman. His gun trained on her, robbed her jewelry, then tried to rape her. He asked her if there was anything else of value in the house, and she swore to him that he'd found everything that was worth anything. But Ramirez wanted her to confirm it for him and told her to swear on Satan that it was true. On July 20th, 1985, Ramirez stole a Toyota and bought a machete. He then drove to the Glendale home of Maxon Niding, 68, and his wife, Layla, 66. The couple were asleep in their beds when Ramirez began chopping at them with a machete. He shot both of them in the head with his .22 revolver. Even although the gunshot wounds killed both of them, Ramirez continued chopping and slicing at them with his machete, severely mutilating them, then robbed them before leaving. Ramirez went to his next murder scene via a fence he used for quick cash, getting rid of the items fast. Next stop was Sun Valley, Los Angeles, where he broke into the Kawanan family's home. 32-year-old father, Chinarom, was fast asleep when Ramirez fired a round from his .22 into his head. He died instantly, not knowing what was about to happen to his wife and son. Sonkid, his 32-year-old wife, was severely beaten and raped multiple times. He then restrained the couple's 8-year-old boy and forced her to lead him to any items of value in the house, grabbing anything that he could sell. Like he did previously, he made the terrified, brutalized woman swear on Satan that there was nothing else worth stealing from them. On August 6, 1985, Ramirez chose 30-year-old Chris Peterson and his 27-year-old wife Virginia as his next victims. He broke into their Oak Ridge house, stealthily made his way to their bedroom. He shot Virginia in the face with his .25 caliber semi-auto. Chris fought him like a warrior, getting shot in the neck, then getting missed by Ramirez's next 2 slugs. Ramirez didn't stick around and fled. Miraculously, both Chris and Virginia survived the ordeal and recovered. On August 8, 1985, Ramirez chose Diamond Bar as his hunting ground for the night. Diamond Bar is a medium-sized city in the eastern Los Angeles County with a majority Asian population that was still unincorporated until just a few years after the Night Stalker murders. The unfortunate family that night were the Abaweths. Mom, Sakina, just 27, her husband, 31-year-old Elia, and their 3-year-old son. Again, he immediately annihilated the man of the house, shooting him in the head with a .25 cal as he slept in his bed. He cuffed Sakina, beat her bloody, and dragged her around her own home, demanding she show him where they kept their valuables. She was savagely raped, and once again, he forced his terrified victim to swear on Satan that she would be silent during his attacks and not scream. The commotion awakened the couple's son, who was just a toddler. He sleepily entered his mom and dad's bedroom where Ramirez restrained him and carried on brutalizing his mother. Once the Night Stalker had done with her, Sakina unbound her little boy, hoping he could make it to a neighbor's house to alert the authorities. Tune in next week for part 2 of Devil in the Darkness. See you then.
Thanks for listening. Go to themurderscene.com or at the Murder Scene Podcast on YouTube for all our social media links. See a full list of research credits and sources in the show notes below, or if you're watching a video, please see the end credits.